Chapter 28. Kurt Hansen, George Alexander's right-hand man, dozed through the rough flight from Las Vegas to Reno. They were in a 10-passenger jet that belonged to the network, and the aircraft took a battering from the high-altitude winds that blew across its assigned flight corridor. Hansen, a powerfully built man with white blonde hair and cat-yellow eyes, was afraid of flying. He could only manage to get on a plane after he had medicated himself. As usual, he nodded off minutes after the aircraft lifted from the runway. George Alexander was the only other passenger. He considered the requisitioning of this executive jet to be one of his most important accomplishments in the 3 years that he had been chief of the Nevada Bureau of the network. Although he spent more than half his time working in his Las Vegas office, he often had reason to fly to far points at the spur of the moment: Reno, Elko, even out of the state to Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. During the first year, he'd taken commercial flights or rented the services of a trustworthy private pilot who could fly the conventional twin-engine craft that Alexander's predecessor had managed to pry out of the network's budget. But it had seemed absurd and short-sighted of the director to force a man of Alexander's position to travel by such relatively primitive means. His time was enormously valuable to the country, his work was sensitive and often required urgent decisions based upon first-hand examination of information to be found only in distant places. After long and arduous lobbying of the director, Alexander had at last been awarded this small jet, and immediately he put 2 full-time pilots, ex-military men, on the payroll of the Nevada Bureau. Sometimes the network pinched pennies to its disadvantage. And George Lincoln Stanhope Alexander, who was an heir to both the fortune of the Pennsylvania Alexanders and to the enormous wealth of the Delaware Stanhopes, had absolutely no patience with people who were penurious. It was true that every dollar had to count, for every dollar of the network's budget was difficult to come by. Because its existence must be kept secret, the organization was funded out of misdirected appropriations meant for other government agencies. $3 billion, the largest single part of the network's yearly budget, came from the Department of Health and Welfare. The network had a deep Gov agent named Jacqueline in the highest policy-making ranks of the health bureaucracy. It was Jacqueline's job to conceive new welfare programs, convince the Secretary of Health and Welfare that those programs were needed, sell them to the Congress, and then establish convincing bureaucratic shells to conceal the fact that the programs were utterly phony, and as federal funds flowed to these false front operations, the money was diverted to the network. Chipping $3 billion out of health was the least risky of the network's funding operations, for health was so gigantic that it never missed such a petty sum. The Department of Defense, which was less flush than health and welfare these days, was nevertheless also guilty of waste, and it was good for at least another billion a year. Lesser amounts, ranging from only 100 million to as much as $500 million, were secretly extracted from the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, and other government bodies on an annual basis. The network was financed with some difficulty, to be sure, but it was undeniably well funded. An executive jet for the chief of the Vital Nevada Bureau was not an extravagance, and Alexander believed his improved performance over the past year had convinced the old man in Washington that this was money well spent. Alexander was proud of the importance of his position. But he was also frustrated because so few people were aware of his great importance. At times, he envied his father and his uncles. Most of them had served their country openly, in a supremely visible fashion, where everyone could see and admire their selfless public spiritedness. Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the Ambassador to France. In positions of that nature, a man was appreciated and respected. George, on the other hand, hadn't filled a post of genuine stature and authority until 6 years ago, when he was 36. During his 20s and early 30s, he had labored at a variety of lesser jobs for the government. These diplomatic and intelligence gathering assignments were never an insult to his family name, but they were always minor postings to embassies in smaller countries like Iceland and Ecuador and Tonga, nothing for which the New York Times would deign to acknowledge his existence. Then, 6 years ago, the network had been formed, and the president had given George the task of developing a reliable South American bureau of the new intelligence agency. That had been exciting, challenging, important work. George had been directly responsible for the expenditure of tens of millions of dollars and, eventually, for the control of hundreds of agents in a dozen countries. After 3 years, the president had declared himself delighted with the accomplishments in South America, and he had asked George to take charge of one of the network's domestic bureaus, Nevada, which had been terribly mismanaged. This slot was one of the half-dozen most powerful in the network's executive hierarchy. George was encouraged by the president to believe that eventually he would be promoted to the bureau chief of the entire western half of the country, and then all the way to the top, if only he could get the floundering Western Division functioning as smoothly as the South American and Nevada offices. In time, he would take the director's chair in Washington and would bear full responsibility for all domestic and foreign intelligence operations. With that title, he would be one of the most powerful men in the United States, more of a force to be reckoned with than any mere Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense could hope to be. But he couldn't tell anyone about his achievements. He could never hope to receive the public acclaim and honor that had been heaped upon other men in his family. The network was clandestine and must remain clandestine if it was to have any value. At least half of the people who worked for it did not even realize it existed. Some thought they were employed by the FBI, others were sure they worked for the CIA, and still others believed that they were in the higher various branches of the Treasury Department, including the Secret Service. None of those people could compromise the network. Only bureau chiefs, their immediate staffs, station chiefs in major cities, and senior field officers who had proved themselves and their loyalty, only those people knew the true nature of their employers and their work. The moment that the news media became aware of the network's existence, all was lost. As he sat in the dimly lighted cabin of the fanjet and watched the clouds racing below, Alexander wondered what his father and his uncles would say if they knew that his service to his country had often required him to issue kill orders. More shocking still to the sensibilities of patrician Easterners like them, on 3 occasions, in South America, Alexander had been in a position where it had been necessary for him to pull the assassin's trigger himself. He had enjoyed those murders so immensely, had been so profoundly thrilled by them, that he had, by choice, performed the executioner's role on half a dozen other assignments. What would the elder Alexanders, the famous statesman, think if they knew he'd soiled his hands with blood? As for the fact that it was sometimes his job to order other men to kill, he supposed his family would understand. The Alexanders were all idealists when they were discussing the way things ought to be, but they were also hard-headed pragmatists when dealing with the way things actually were. They knew that the worlds of domestic military security and international espionage were not children's playgrounds. George liked to believe that they might even find it in their hearts to forgive him for having pulled the trigger himself. After all, he had never killed an ordinary citizen or person of real worth. His targets had always been spies, traitors, more than a few of them had been cold-blooded killers themselves. Scum. He had only killed scum. It wasn't a pretty job, but it also wasn't without a measure of real dignity and heroism. At least that was the way George saw it. He thought of himself as heroic. Yes, he was sure that his father and uncles would give him their blessings, if only he were permitted to tell them. The jet hit an especially bad patch of turbulence. It yawed, bounced, shuddered. Kurt Henson snorted in his sleep but didn't wake. When the plane settled down once more, Alexander looked out the window at the milky white, moonlit, feminine roundness of the clouds below, and he thought of the Evans woman. She was quite lovely. Her file folder was on the seat beside him. He picked it up, opened it, and stared at her photograph. Quite lovely indeed. He decided he would kill her himself when the time came, and that thought gave him an instant erection. He enjoyed killing. He didn't try to pretend otherwise with himself, no matter what face he had to present to the world. All of his life, for reasons he had never been able to fully ascertain, he had been fascinated by death, intrigued by the form and nature and possibilities of it, enthralled by the study and theory of its meaning. He considered himself a messenger of death, a divinely appointed headsman. Murder was, in many ways, more thrilling to him than sex. His taste for violence would not have been tolerated for long in the old FBI, perhaps not even in the new, thoroughly politicized FBI, or in many other congressionally monitored police agencies. But in this unknown organization, in this secret and incomparably cozy place, he thrived. He closed his eyes and thought about Christina Evans. Chapter 29. In Tina's dream, Danny was at the far end of a long tunnel. He was in chains, sitting in the center of a small, well-lighted cavern, but the passageway that led to him was shadowy and reeked of danger. Danny called to her again and again, begging her to save him before the roof of his underground prison caved in and buried him alive. She started down the tunnel toward him, determined to get him out of there, and something reached for her from a narrow cleft in the wall. She was peripherally aware of a soft, fire-like glow from beyond the cleft, and of a mysterious figure silhouetted against the reddish backdrop. She turned, and she was looking into the grinning face of death, as if he were peering out at her from the bowels of hell. The crimson eyes, the shriveled flesh, the lacework of maggots on his cheek. She cried out, but then she saw that death could not quite reach her. The hole in the wall was not wide enough for him to step through. Into her passageway, he could only thrust one arm at her, and his long, bony fingers were an inch or two short of her. Danny began calling again, and she continued down the dusky tunnel toward him. A dozen times, she passed chinks in the wall, and death glared out at her from every one of those apertures, screamed and cursed and raged at her, but none of the holes was large enough to allow him through. She reached Danny, and when she touched him, the chains fell magically away from his arms and legs. She said, "I was scared." And Danny said, "I made the holes in the walls smaller. I made sure he couldn't reach you, couldn't hurt you." At 8:30 Friday morning, Tina came awake, smiling and excited. She shook Elliot until she woke him. Blinking sleepily, he sat up. "What's wrong?" "Danny just sent me another dream." Taking in her broad smile, he said, "Obviously, it wasn't the nightmare." "Not at all. Danny wants us to come to him. He wants us just to walk into the place where they're keeping him and take him out. We'd be killed before we could reach him. We can't just charge in like the cavalry. We've got to use the media and the courts to free him." I don't think so. The two of us can't fight the entire organization that's behind Kinbeck plus the staff of some secret military research center. Danny's going to make it safe for us, she said confidently. He's going to use this power of his to help us get in there. That isn't possible. You said you believed. I do, Elliot said, yawning and stretching elaborately. I do believe. But how can he help us? How can he guarantee our safety? I don't know. But that's what he was telling me in the dream. I'm sure of it. She recounted the dream in detail, and Elliot admitted that her interpretation wasn't trained. But even if Danny could somehow get us in, he said, we don't know where they're keeping him. This secret installation could be anywhere. And maybe it doesn't even exist. And if it does exist, they might not be holding him there anyway. It exists, and that's where he is, she said, trying to sound more certain than she actually was. She was within reach of Danny. She felt almost as if she had him in her arms again, and she didn't want anyone to tell her that he might be a hair's breadth beyond her grasp. Okay, Elliot said, wiping at the corners of his sleep-matted eyes. Let's say this secret installation exists. That doesn't help us a whole hell of a lot. It could be anywhere in those mountains. No, she said. It has to be within a few miles of where Jaworski intended to go with the scouts. Okay. That's probably true. But that covers a hell of a lot of rugged terrain. We couldn't begin to conduct a thorough search of it. Tina's confidence couldn't be shaken. Danny will pinpoint it for us. Danny's going to tell us where he is? He's going to try, I think. I sensed that in the dream. How's he going to do it? I don't know. But I have this feeling that if we just find some way, some means of focusing his energy, channeling it. Such as? She stared at the tangled bedclothes as if she were searching for inspiration in the creases of the linens. Her expression would have been appropriate to the face of a gypsy fortune teller appearing with a clairvoyant frown at Teals. Maps, she said suddenly. What? Don't they publish terrain maps of the wilderness areas? Backpackers and other nature lovers would need them. Not minutely detailed things. Basically maps that show the lay of the land, hills, valleys, the courses of rivers and streams, footpaths, abandoned logging trails, that sort of thing. I'm sure Jaworski had maps. I know he did. I saw them at the parent-son scout meeting when he explained why the trip would be perfectly safe. I suppose any sporting goods store in Reno ought to have maps of at least the nearest parts of the Sierras. Maybe if we can get a map and spread it out. Well, maybe Danny will find a way to show us exactly where he is. How? I'm not sure yet. She threw back the covers and got out of bed. Let's get the maps first. We'll worry about the rest of it later. Come on. Let's get showered and dressed. The stores will be open in an hour or so. Because of the foul-up at the Blakosky place, George Alexander didn't get to bed until 5:30 Friday morning. Still furious with his subordinates for letting Stryker and the woman escape again, he had difficulty getting to sleep. He finally nodded off around 7 a.m. At 10 o'clock, he was awakened by the telephone. The director was calling from Washington. They used an electronic scrambling device, so they could speak candidly, and the old man was furious and characteristically blunt. As Alexander endured the director's accusations and demands, he realized that his own future with the network was at stake. If he failed to stop Stryker and the Evans woman, his dream of assuming the director's chair in a few years would never become a reality. After the old man hung up, Alexander called his own office, in no mood to be told that Elliot Stryker and Christina Evans were still at large. But that was exactly what he heard. He ordered men pulled off other jobs and assigned to the manhunt. I want them found before another day passes, Alexander said. That bastard's killed one of us now. He can't get away with that. I want him eliminated. And the bitch with him. Both of them. Dead. Chapter 30. 2 sporting goods stores and 2 gun shops were within easy walking distance of the hotel. The first sporting goods dealer did not carry the maps, and although the second usually had them, it was currently sold out. Elliot and Tina found what they needed in one of the gun shops, a set of 12 wilderness maps of the Sierras, designed with backpackers and hunters in mind. The set came in a leatherette-covered case and sold for $100. Back in the hotel room, they opened one of the maps on the bed, and Elliot said, "Now what?" For a moment, Tina considered the problem. Then she went to the desk, opened the center drawer, and withdrew a folder of hotel stationery. In the folder was a cheap plastic ballpoint pen with the hotel name on it. With the pen, she returned to the bed and sat beside the open map. She said, "People who believe in the occult have a thing they call automatic writing. Ever hear of it?" "Sure." "Spirit writing. A ghost supposedly guides your hand to deliver a message from beyond." Always sounded like the worst sort of bunkum to me. Well, bunkum or not, I'm going to try something like that. Except, I don't need a ghost to guide my hand. I'm hoping Danny can do it. Don't you have to be in a trance, like a medium at a seance? I'm just going to completely relax, make myself open and receptive. I'll hold the pen against the map, and maybe Danny can draw the route for us. Elliot pulled a chair beside the bed and sat. I don't believe for a minute it's going to work. Totally nuts. But I'll be as quiet as a mouse and give it a chance. Tina stared at the map and tried to think of nothing but the appealing greens, blues, yellows, and pinks that the cartographers had used to indicate various types of terrain. She allowed her eyes to swim out of focus. A minute passed. 2 minutes. 3. She tried closing her eyes. Another minute. Nothing. She turned the map over and tried the other side of it. Still nothing. Give me another map, she said. Elliot withdrew another one from the leatherette case and handed it to her. He refolded the first map as she unfolded the second. Half an hour and 5 maps later, Tina's hand suddenly skipped across the paper as if someone had bumped her arm. She felt a peculiar pulling sensation that seemed to come from within her hand, and she stiffened in surprise. Instantly the invasive power retreated from her. What was that? Elliot asked. Danny. He tried. You're sure? Positive. But he startled me, and I guess even the little bit of resistance I offered was enough to push him away. At least we know this is the right map. Let me try again. She put the pen at the edge of the map once more, and she let her eyes drift out of focus. The air temperature plummeted. She tried not to think about the chill. She tried to banish all thoughts. Her right hand, in which she held the pen, grew rapidly colder than any other part of her. She felt the unpleasant, inner pulling again. Her fingers ached with the cold. Abruptly her hand swung across the map, then back, then described a series of circles. The pen made meaningless scrawls on the paper. After half a minute, she felt the power leave her hand again. No good, she said. The map flew into the air, as if someone had tossed it in anger or frustration. Elliot got out of his chair and reached for the map, but it spun into the air again. It flapped noisily to the other end of the room and then back again, finally falling like a dead bird onto the floor at Elliot's feet. Jesus, he said softly. The next time I read a story in the newspaper about some guy, who says he was picked up in a flying saucer and taken on a tour of the universe, I won't be so quick to laugh. If I see many more inanimate objects dancing around, I'm going to start believing in everything, no matter how freaky. Tina got up from the bed, massaging her cold right hand. I guess I'm offering too much resistance. But it feels so weird when he takes control. I can't help stiffening a little. I guess you were right about needing to be in a trance. I'm afraid I can't help you with that. I'm a good cook, but I'm not a hypnotist. She blinked. Hypnosis. Of course. That'll probably do the trick. Maybe it will. But where do you expect to find a hypnotist? The last time I looked, they weren't setting up shops on street corners. Billy Sandstone, she said. Who? He's a hypnotist. He lives right here in Reno. He has a stage act. It's a brilliant act. I wanted to use him in magic. But he was tied up in an exclusive contract with a chain of Reno Tahoe hotels. If you can get hold of Billy, he can hypnotize me. Then maybe I'll be relaxed enough to make this automatic writing work. Do you know his phone number? And it's probably not listed. But I do know his agent's number. I can get through to him that way. She hurried to the telephone. Chapter 31. Billy Sandstone was in his late 30s, as small and lean as a jockey, and his watchword seemed to be neatness. His shoes shone like black mirrors. The creases in his slacks were as sharp as blades, and his blue sport shirt was starched, crisp. His hair was razor cut, and he groomed his mustache so meticulously that it almost appeared to have been painted on his upper lip. Billy's dining room was neat too. The table, the chairs, the credenza, and the hutch all glowed warmly because of the prodigious amount of furniture polish that had been buffed into the wood with even more vigor than he had employed when shining his dazzling shoes. Fresh roses were arranged in a cut crystal vase in the center of the table, and clean lines of light gleamed in the exquisite glass. The draperies hung in perfectly measured folds. An entire battalion of nitpickers and fuss budgets would be hard-pressed to find a speck of dust in this room. Elliot and Tina spread the map on the table and sat down across from each other. Billy said, "Automatic writing is bunk, Christina. You must know that." "I do, Billy. I know that." "Well, then but I want you to hypnotize me anyway." "You're a level-headed person, Tina," Billy said. "This really doesn't seem like you." "I know," she said. "If you'd just tell me why. If you tell me what this is all about, maybe I could help you better." "Billy," she said, "if I tried to explain, we would be here all afternoon." "Longer," Elliot said. "And we don't have much time," Tina said. "A lot's at stake here, Billy. more than you can imagine. They hadn't told him anything about Danny. Sandstone didn't have the faintest idea why they were in Reno or what they were seeking in the mountains. Elliot said, "I'm sure this seems ridiculous, Billy. You're probably wondering if I'm some sort of lunatic. You're wondering if maybe I've messed with Tina's mind. Which definitely isn't the case," Tina said. "Right," Elliot said. "Her mind was messed up before I ever met her." The joke seemed to relax Sandstone, as Elliot had hoped it would. Lunatics and just plain irrational people didn't intentionally try to amuse. Elliot said, "I assure you, Billy, we haven't lost our marbles. And this is a matter of life and death." "It really is," Tina said. "Okay," Billy said. "You don't have time to tell me about it now. I'll accept that. But will you tell me one day when you aren't in such a damn rush?" "Absolutely," Tina said. "I'll tell you everything. Just please, please, put me in a trance." "All right," Billy Sandstone said. He was wearing a gold signet ring. He turned it around, so the face of it was on the wrong side, the palm side, of his finger. He held his hand in front of Tina's eyes. "Keep your eyes on the ring and listen only to my voice." "Wait a second," she said. She pulled the cap off the red felt tip pen that Elliot had purchased at the hotel newsstand just before they'd caught a taxi to Sandstone's house. Elliot had suggested a change in the color of ink, so they would be able to tell the difference between the meaningless scribbles that were already on the map and any new marks that might be made. Putting the point of the pen to the paper, Tina said, "Okay, Billy. Do your stuff." Elliot was not sure when Tina slipped under the hypnotist's spell, and he had no idea how this smooth mesmerism was accomplished. All Sandstone did was move one hand slowly back and forth in front of Tina's face, simultaneously speaking to her in a quiet, rhythmic voice, frequently using her name. Elliot almost fell into a trance himself. He blinked his eyes and tuned out Sandstone's melodious voice when he realized that he was succumbing to it. Tina stared vacantly into space. The hypnotist lowered his hand and turned his ring around as it belonged. "You're in a deep sleep, Tina." "Yes." "Your eyes are open, but you are in a deep, deep sleep." "Yes." "You will stay in that deep sleep until I tell you to wake up. Do you understand?" "Yes." "You will remain relaxed and receptive." "Yes." "Nothing will startle you." "No." "You aren't really involved in this. You're just the method of transmission, like a telephone." "Telephone," she said thickly. You will remain totally passive until you feel the urge to use the pen in your hand. Alright. When you feel the urge to use the pen, you will not resist it. You will flow with it. Understood? Yes. You will not be bothered by anything Elliot and I say to each other. You will respond to me only when I speak directly to you. Understood? Yes. Now, open yourself to whoever wants to speak through you. They waited. A minute passed, then another. Billy Sandstone watched Tina intently for a while, but at last, he shifted impatiently in his chair. He looked at Elliot and said, I don't think this spirit writing stuff is. The map rustled, drawing their attention. The corners curled and uncurled, curled and uncurled, again and again, like the pulse of a living thing. The air was colder. The map stopped curling. The rustling ceased. Tina lowered her gaze from the empty air to the map, and her hand began to move. It didn't swoop and dart uncontrollably this time, it crept carefully, hesitantly across the paper, leaving a thin red line of ink like a thread of blood. Sandstone was rubbing his hands up and down his arms to ward off the steadily deepening chill that had gripped the room. Frowning, glancing up at the heating vents, he started to get out of his chair. Elliot said, "Don't bother checking the air conditioning. It isn't on. And the heat hasn't failed either." What? The cold comes from the spirit, Elliot said, deciding to stick with the occult terminology, not wanting to get bogged down in the real story about Danny. Spirit? Yes. Whose spirit? Could be anyone's. Are you serious? Pretty much. Sandstone stared at him as if to say, "You're nuts, but are you dangerous?" Elliot pointed to the map. See? As Tina's hand moved slowly over the paper, the corners of the map began to curl and uncurl again. How is she doing that? Sandstone asked. She isn't. The ghost, I suppose. That's right. An expression of pain settled over Billy's face, as if he were suffering genuine physical discomfort because of Elliot's belief in ghosts. Apparently, Billy liked his view of the world to be as neat and uncluttered as everything else about him. If he started believing in ghosts, he'd have to reconsider his opinions about a lot of other things too, and then life would become intolerably messy. Elliot sympathized with the hypnotist. Right now, he longed for the rigidly structured routine of the law office, the neatly ordered paragraphs of legal case books, and the timeless rules of the courtroom. Tina let the pen drop from her fingers. She lifted her gaze from the map. Her eyes remained unfocused. Are you finished? Billy asked her. Yes. Are you sure? Yes. With a few simple sentences and a sharp clap of his hands, the hypnotist brought her out of the trance. She blinked in confusion, then glanced down at the route that she had marked on the map. She smiled at Elliot. It worked. By God, it worked. Apparently it did. She pointed to the terminus of the red line. That's where he is, Elliot. That's where they're keeping him. It's not going to be easy getting into country like that, Elliot said. We can do it. We'll need good, insulated outdoor clothes. Boots. Snowshoes in case we have to walk very far in open country. Do you know how to use snowshoes? It can't be that hard. Hold on, Elliot said. I'm still not convinced your dream meant what you think it did. Based on what you said happened in it, I don't see how you reach the conclusion that Danny's going to help us get into the installation. We might get to this place and find we can't slip around its defenses. Billy Sandstone looked from Tina to Elliot, baffled. Danny? You're Danny, Tina? But isn't he? Tina said. Elliot, it wasn't only what happened in the dream that led me to this conclusion. What I felt in it was far more important. I can't explain that part of it. The only way you could understand is if you had the dream yourself. I'm sure he was telling me that he could help us get to him. Elliot turned the map to be able to study it more closely. From the head of the table, Billy said, but isn't Danny? Tina said. Elliot, listen, I told you he would show us where he's being kept, and he drew that route for us. So far, I'm batting 1,000. I also feel he's going to help us get into the place, and I don't see any reason why I should strike out on that one. It's just, we'd be walking into their arms, Elliot said. Whose arms? Billy Sandstone asked. Tina said, Elliot, what happens if we stay here, hiding out until we can think of an alternative? How much time do we have? Not much. They're going to find us sooner or later, and when they get their hands on us, they'll kill us. Kill? Billy Sandstone asked. There's a word I don't like. It's right up there on the bad word list beside broccoli. We've gotten this far because we've kept moving and we've been aggressive, Tina said. If we change our approach, if we suddenly get too cautious, that'll be our downfall, not our salvation. You two sound like you're in a war, Billy Sandstone said uneasily. You're probably right, Elliot told Tina. One thing I learned in the military was you have to stop and regroup your forces once in a while, but if you stop too long, the tide will turn and wash right over you. should I maybe go listen to the news? Billy Sandstone asked. Is there a war on? Have we invaded France? To Tina, Elliot said, what else will we need besides thermal clothing, boots, and snowshoes? A jeep, she said. That's a tall order. What about a tank? Billy Sandstone asked. Going to war, you might prefer a tank. Tina said, don't be silly, Billy. A jeep is all we need. Just trying to be helpful, love. And thanks for remembering I exist. A jeep or an explorer, anything with four-wheel drive, Tina told Elliot. We don't want to walk farther than necessary. We don't want to walk at all if we can help it. There must be some sort of road into the place, even if it's well concealed. If we're lucky, we'll have Danny when we come out, and he probably won't be in any condition to trek through the Sierras in the dead of winter. I have an Explorer, Billy said. I guess I could have some money transferred from my Vegas bank, Elliot said. But what if they're watching my accounts down there? That would lead them to us fast. And since the banks are closed for the holiday, we couldn't do anything until next week. They might find us by then. What about your American Express card? She asked. You mean, charge a jeep? There's no limit on the card, is there? Number. But I read a newspaper story once about a guy who bought a Rolls-Royce with his card. You can do that sort of thing as long as they know for sure you're capable of paying the entire bill when it comes due a month later. It sounds crazy, Elliot said. But I guess we can try. I have an Explorer, Billy Sandstone said. Let's get the address of the local dealership, Tina said. We'll see if they'll accept the card. I have an Explorer, Billy said. They turned to him, startled. I take my act to Lake Tahoe a few weeks every winter, Billy said. You know what it's like down there this time of year. Snow up to your ass. I hate flying the Tahorina shuttle. The plane's so damn small. And you know what a ticky-tacky airport they have at Tahoe. So I usually just drive down the day before I open. An Explorer is the only thing I'd want to take through the mountains on a bad day. Are you going to Tahoe soon? Tina asked. Number. I don't open until the end of the month. Will you be needing the Explorer in the next couple of days? Elliot asked. No. Can we borrow it? Well, I guess so. Tina leaned across the corner of the table, grabbed Billy's head in her hands, pulled his face to hers, and kissed him. You're a lifesaver, Billy. And I mean that literally. I'm a small circlet of hard candy. Maybe things are breaking right for us, Elliot said. Maybe we'll get Danny out of there after all. We will, Tina said. I know it. The roses in the crystal vase twirled around like a group of spinning, red-headed ballerinas. Startled, Billy Sandstone jumped up, knocking over his chair. The drapes drew open, slid shut, drew open, slid shut, even though no one was near the draw cords. The chandelier began to swing in a lazy circle, and the dangling crystals cast prismatic patterns of light on the walls. Billy stared, open-mouthed. Elliot knew how disoriented Billy was feeling, and he felt sorry for the man. After half a minute, all of the unnatural movements stopped, and the room rapidly grew warm again. How did you do that? Billy demanded. We didn't, Tina said. Not a ghost, Billy said adamantly. Not a ghost either, Elliot said. Billy said, you can borrow the Explorer. But first you've got to tell me what in hell's going on. I don't care how much of a hurry you are in. You can at least tell me a little of it. Otherwise, I'm going to shrivel up and die of curiosity. Tina consulted Elliot. Well? Elliot said, Billy, you might be better off not knowing. Impossible. We're up against some damn dangerous people. If they thought you knew about them, look, Billy said, I'm not just a hypnotist. I'm something of a magician. That's really what I most wanted to be, but I didn't really have the skill for it. So I worked up this act built around hypnotism. But magic, that's my one great love. I just have to know how you did that trick with the drapes, the roses, and the corners of the map. I just have to know. Earlier this morning it had occurred to Elliot that he and Tina were the only people who knew that the official story of the Sierra's accident was a lie. If they were killed, the truth would die with them, and the cover-up would continue. Considering the high price that they had paid for the pathetically insufficient information they had obtained, he couldn't tolerate the prospect of all their pain and fear and anxiety having been for naught. Elliot said, Billy, do you have a tape recorder? Sure. It's nothing fancy. It's a little one I carry with me. I do some comedy lines in the act, and I use the recorder to develop new material, correct problems with my timing. It doesn't have to be fancy, Elliot said. Just so it works. We'll give you a condensed version of the story behind all of this, and we'll record it as we go. Then I'll mail the tape to one of my law partners. He shrugged. Not much insurance, but better than nothing. I'll get the recorder, Billy said, hurrying out of the dining room. Tina folded the map. "It's nice to see you smiling again," Elliot said. "I must be crazy," she said. "We still have dangerous work ahead of us. We're still up against this bunch of cutthroats. We don't know what we'll walk into in those mountains. So why do I feel terrific all of a sudden?" "You feel good," Elliot said, "because we're not running anymore. We're going on the offensive." And foolhardy as that might be, it does a lot for a person's self-respect. Can a couple of people like us really have a chance of winning when we're up against something as big as the government itself? "Well," Elliot said, "I happen to believe that individuals are more apt to act responsibly and morally than institutions ever do, which at least puts us on the side of justice. And I also believe individuals are always smarter and better adapted to survival, at least in the long run, than any institution." Let's just hope my philosophy doesn't turn out to be half-baked. At 1:30 Kurt Henson came into George Alexander's office in downtown Reno. They found the car that Stryker rented. "It's in a public lot about 3 blocks from here." "Used recently?" Alexander asked. "Number?" "The engine's cold. There's thick frost on the windows. It's been parked there overnight." "He's not stupid," Alexander said. "He's probably abandoned the damn thing." "You want to put a watch on it anyway?" "Better do that," Alexander said. "Sooner or later they'll make a mistake. Coming back to the car might be it." "I don't think so. But it might." Henson left the room. Alexander took a Valium out of a tin that he carried in his jacket pocket, and he washed it down with a swallow of hot coffee, which he poured from the silver pot on his desk. This was his second pill since he'd gotten out of bed just 3.5 hours ago, but he still felt edgy. Stryker and the woman were proving to be worthy opponents. Alexander never liked to have worthy opponents. He preferred them to be soft and easy. Where were they?